Okay, now we're going to examine the long-run macro equilibrium in labor markets. When you think about labor markets, I think it's important to recognize that with long-run macroeconomics is about the longer-term trend in the economy, not the ups and downs so much, not the recessions and the booms, but that long-term growing continual increase over time of GDP. To analyze this, we think of four different elements, the key elements of long-run macro. One is the spending shares of GDP, that is what determines the amount of consumption versus investment versus government purchases versus net exports. In the economy, there was the spending allocation model that we introduced to try to explain this part of long-run macro. The second is really what's going on in the labor markets. A lot of the stuff comes from the microeconomic theory of supply and demand for labor, but there's some special considerations of the macro, and one is the notion of the natural rate of unemployment, which applies in the long run, and that generates the notion of long-run employment growth over time without the ups and downs in the economy. We're going to be considering that subject today in this particular lesson. And then later we'll consider two other elements of long-run macro. One is the productivity and economic growth, and that'll uncover this idea of a growth accounting formula, very important for analyzing the long run. And then finally, the role of money. But anyway, this time today, in this lesson, I want to consider the unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment. When you think about the long run, whether it's employment or unemployment or GDP, it's important to think about what economists mean by the long run. Long run would be illustrated in this picture, which is GDP growing over time smoothly, but then there's a recession sometimes where GDP falls below real GDP falls below potential GDP. Again, the potential GDP represents a longer term trend, but real GDP fluctuates around that. When we think about policies to affect the long run, like say to reflect that trend, to make it go faster, we frequently think of supply-side policies. When we think of the short-run macro, it's frequently associated with demand-side policies. The reality is it's kind of hard to distinguish. The dichotomy is not always so clear between the long run and short run. And in fact, there's a lot of disagreement, little agreement about what the appropriate length of times are, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, for example. In fact, John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, once made the statement, in the long run, we're all dead. And economists have been arguing what that means for a long time. So in some sense, this long run versus short run is a source of considerable disagreement amongst economists. We want to start by looking at the long run, and in particular long run in labor markets, and then later consider these very important shorter run fluctuations. So with respect to labor markets, one important macroeconomic indicator is the unemployment rate. This shows the unemployment rate from the late 40s until the present, and you can see the ups and downs in the economy. Those roughly are associated with the recessions and booms. But there's also some secular movement in this, and you can see the secular movement in this period rather low, then really rather high up here, rather low in that area. And so those secular movements are what you need to consider for the long run. And in addition, if you note, there's actually never a period where unemployment gets to zero. Even with that scale at 2 at the bottom, you can see the lowest point possible is 2.5, and that's very unusual. It's usually, even at the minimum, much higher than zero. So the important thing is, why is the unemployment rate above zero, even in normal times? It's possible to sort of think about different periods in the economy where the average unemployment rate is, say, around 5%, a little over. That's what's illustrated in that picture, in the 50s and 60s to the mid-70s. And then periods where its average is a little higher, that's really the 80s and the 90s. And then a period where it's a little lower, and that's the most recent period. And of course, we don't know exactly where it is. This is a guess or an estimate that economists use. The most recent period over on the right is estimated by the Congressional Budget Office is about 5.3% now. And note that the actual unemployment rate is still well above that, if you like, natural level. It's still quite above, so there's quite a bit of difference. And in the long run, we think we'll come back to that level, but the real question is when and how. The first thing we need to look at is what determines that long run level. You also look at this picture, you note there's a little thing here marked over on the right. That's to illustrate the fact that the labor force participation rate in the American economy is actually quite low now, and that's made the unemployment rate look a little lower than it otherwise would be, because remember, the unemployment rate is the ratio of total unemployed to employed plus unemployed, and the labor force, when people drop out of the labor force, they're not counted either unemployed or employed, and so the number is actually higher when you take that into account. All these are examples of what's called the natural unemployment rate, and you can see there's a great difference over time secularly, but all above zero. One little anecdote I might illustrate about this historically. At one time in the 60s, some economists argued that the unemployment rate would be around 4% in normal times. And in fact, that proved to be very rare, as you can see even back then, just dip below once, generally above. So I was actually working in public policy at the time when this 4% was there, worked for the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House. We thought it'd be useful to raise the definition for 4% to 4.9%, which is really the dashed line above the red line, and then reported to the Congress, this is what we're going to do. One of the congressmen at the time headed one of the top committees, Joint Economic Committee, looked at us and said, boy, if you economists were doctors, we had a plague in the economy and normal temperatures rose, your definition would be to just raise the definition of normal temperature. And it's really kind of the problem, because when you raise the natural rate like this, people are going to say, hey, why can't you do better? But you also have to reflect the reality of the labor markets. So that's really the notion of the unemployment rate and the natural unemployment rate. There's a picture of me with President Ford at that time, just to prove I'm telling a true story. Why is the unemployment rate greater than zero in equilibrium? Well, there's two reasons. One goes to basic microeconomics, and you can illustrate that idea of job rationing with a supply and demand curve. In fact, let's just look at a diagram to illustrate this. It occurs when the wage is higher than the market equilibrium, and that causes unemployment. An example of that is minimum wage. It's not the only time it happens, but the picture is pretty straightforward. So this is a picture of the supply and demand for labor. You can see upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand. The equilibrium would be at the intersection of the two curves. But if for some reason the wage is higher than that market equilibrium, either because of a government-imposed wage or something else that's going on in the market, firms might want to pay workers at the firm a little bit of extra to induce them to stay, for example. Whatever it is, that wage may be higher than the equilibrium, in which case there's unemployment. The quantity of labor demanded on the labor demand curve is less than the quantity of labor supplied in the labor supply curve, so that's really a surplus or unemployment. So one possible reason for this fact that unemployment never gets to zero is this. However, that's probably a relatively small thing in the total amount of unemployment. After all, many workers are not subject to the minimum wage. Their wage is above the minimum wage. So there's probably something else going on that explains why unemployment is going to be above zero, even in the best of times, and certainly above zero on average. The other explanation is really job search. Is people are always going through the labor market. Some are finding a job for the first time. Some are being laid off, or they're quitting to look for another job. And the way to think about that is this to and fro. There's jobs being created, there's jobs being destroyed as firms close, as firms open. And then there's unemployment benefits. People get unemployment benefits when they're unemployed. That may give them the incentive to remain unemployed for a while longer than they otherwise would. One way to think about all this is just simply with a diagram to illustrate this job search and flows in and out of the market, in and out of unemployment. So this is a picture where you have these little schematic pictures of people, some employed, some unemployed, looking for work in the newspaper or on the internet, and some not in the labor force. And we know the unemployment rate is the ratio of the total number of unemployed to the sum of the employed plus unemployed. But as you can see, many things can happen over time in this labor market. For example, people in the labor force that can be either employed or unemployed. But if you're not in the labor force, you might want to enter the labor force. So that if you look at the diagram, there's a point here where you move out and to look for jobs or re-enter the labor force. You're not in the labor force and you re-enter. and you maybe start by looking for work. Then you become unemployed when looking for work. Or you might be lucky and find a job right away, in which case you go and become employed. But if for a while you move into the labor market, let's say you leave school or you graduate, or retired person wants to go back to work, the first thing that's going to happen, at least for a while, for many of them, would be unemployed. And they don't find a job instantly. So that's part of the unemployment. And then you have people who are going to maybe quit their job or lose their job, and some of them might find a job right away, just stay employed. Some of them might become unemployed for a while while they work for a job. Some of them might actually just drop out of the labor force. Maybe they're going to retire or something like that. So all sorts of things can happen in this flow of workers in and out of unemployment, labor force, or employed. If they go into the employed category, then eventually we hope they'll find a job and they become employed, but some of them might actually drop out of the labor force. And if they drop out of the labor force, then they're no longer counted as unemployed or employed, of course. And I've noted that this movement out of the labor force has been a trend that's increased in recent years in the U.S. So as you can see, if you think about this to and fro, back and forth, the labor market, there's always going to be some unemployment, and even in the normal times. And that unemployment will generally tend to go down when the economy is really doing well in a boom, and go up when the economy is not doing so well, but on average, greater than zero. Finally, once you think about the normal or natural unemployment rate, you can think about the growth of employment over the long haul. The Congressional Budget Office says that the natural unemployment rate is about 5.3% in the U.S. economy. They also project labor force growth. What is labor force growth? Well, according to the CBO, they say it's about 0.7% per year looking out in the near term, next few years. They also show it's going to decline to about 0.4% per year because of declining birth rates and changes in immigration that'll start to take place in about a decade. And you can compare that to actually much more rapid employment growth in the U.S. in the 70s, 80s, 90s, until recently, when it was about 1.6% per year, almost 4 times greater than what is projected. So that makes a big difference for growth in the economy, because growth depends to some extent on what employment is. And finally, you can think about the potential employment, the employment that would occur when the economy is operating at normal times, when the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate. And to get that, you just take the labor force, all right, as calculated, whether it's growing at 0.4% or 1.6%, multiply it by the fraction of the labor force that's employed, so that's 1 minus the unemployment rate, and you get a measure of what might be called potential employment, which is how unemployment is on average as the economy grows, when there's neither a boom nor a recession. So that's what goes on in labor markets over the long run, and what our objective is now to combine that with other aspects of long-run macro to determine what's happening to GDP over the long term. Thank you.